Okay, so you are about to launch the National Data Center Academy, and I guess the first place to start would just be what sort of where did the idea come from? What was the inspiration, the idea behind it?
Well, Phil, as you know, I do a lot of data center assessment work on behalf of DCDC there, but we also do assessments directly for our customers on the Code of Conduct for data centers, the Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act, and the EN 50605-1, which is the new data center maturity model. And one thing I've noticed over the 15 or so years that I've been doing data center assessments is that a lot of sites don't appear to understand the basic principles of data center engineering, airflow management in particular, and they're leaving a lot of what I would call money on the table. You know, there are things that they could do which would reduce their energy consumption, but they either don't know or don't feel that it's going to provide the necessary return on investment for that. But I think the other thing is that we're facing an acute energy problem, not just in the UK, but globally. We've got more data center focused regulation coming in. We know that from the EU, and we know about the forecasted shortage of engineering skills, because it's been mentioned in almost every event that I've been to in the last 10 years. There's been a session and a discussion on skills, and yet over 10 years, nothing appears to have been done. You know, you've got the sporadic odd things. You know, we've got the digital futures thing, the UTC colleges. I think there are 4 of them now. But that's focused on 14 to 18-year-olds. There doesn't seem to be much for transition guys or, you know, people coming in from other industries. I mean, you know, if we're going to see the move to net zero, then we're going to have a lot of oil and gas guys that are mission critically trained coming into the marketplace potentially. And of course, we've got that great pool of what I would call enabled people that work in the armed services. You know, they are trained to react to very changeable conditions, and they have to think on their feet. And you know, and we all know that ex-military guys appear to have the skills to deal with it in data engineering, and we know that there are some senior military personnel that are now in quite senior positions in the data center construction market, you know, and operations, which is a good thing. So we felt that we looked at the training capabilities at the moment, and most of them are virtual or classroom based. And we know why the virtual came up. The virtual came up because obviously we had the pandemic, and you couldn't physically go to a classroom. But we started this kind of initiative and thinking probably in 2016, so 4 or 5 years before the pandemic started. And we still felt that there was a need for some practical skills. So, you know, that's why we've created this academy. We're planning a number of things, which we'll cover later on. But we've also been talking to the actual other training providers, you know, over a period of time, and they love the idea. So it's just and they've always said, you know, we'll get it built and then we'll come up and we'll start to use it. So we decided an opportunity came up on a building not very far from your offices in Leamington Spa. When we figured that it was the kind of centre of the UK, and you can get to it fairly easily on either train or even plane if you want to. Birmingham Airport's about 30 minutes away. Got the A1 and the M1 motorways and the M40 motorway literally going past our door. And we felt this would be a good place to locate the site, so that we could access London market, Manchester, Scotland, and anything that arises from the government's new spatial strategy of spreading the data center love around the country, which I think is a good thing. And I actually did propose it to them. So I'm quite pleased that happened. So yeah, that's where we've been kind of doing. And well, I think personally it's long overdue, because I remember from my apprenticeship, because I was an ex-BT apprentice, and after the induction week, I did 4 weeks at the engineering college in Paul Street in central London near Old Street. And we did things like, you know, making off joints, and not those sort of joints, cable joints, and basically doing a lot of cabinet work. And they basically had everything there, and we were actually in there in the cabinets and in the pillars doing cross-connect training and all that sort of thing, just to give us the flavour that when we went out in the field with the other permanent engineers, etc., that we could observe them and understand that what we're talking about. And then, when we moved on to the next year of our apprenticeship, which is more telephone exchange focused, and this is back in the very old days, because I was there in the transition from electromechanical to electronic. So we had to do a lot of work on Strowger selectors and things like that. So I remember a particularly evil week doing relay adjustment. Right? And believe you me, you really do not want to be doing relay adjustment. But we had a whole week on it, so we could, understand what we needed to do, and that applied to some of the new electronic systems as well. So we always had that physical, hands-on, practical training, and yet, this industry doesn't appear to have that. It's it's on the job and classroom, theories in the classroom, on the job. But when you're talking about energy efficiency and sustainability principles, you're operating outside of the box, right? You're asking people to raise temperatures. You're asking people to do different things, manage their airflow, etc. And this is stuff that they might not be able to do on site because of the contractual arrangements they have with their customers and their service level agreements. So what we wanted to do is to be able to give them the opportunity to use one of our rooms is actually going to be set up as kind of like an aircraft simulator. So we can actually be able to put different fault conditions into that environment and see how the guys deal with. We're going to have a virtual knock and a real knock, and we're hoping to have some virtual reality and augmented reality training courses as well. So, and it just, every time we think about this, Phil, different elements of data center engineering and management and sales all comes into play. And, we just think it's going to be a huge and rapid success, which is why we put our own money into it. I mean, we've actually been seeking funding from other bodies as well, and they're all kind of not quite sure about that. So we thought, no, let's take the jump, because as I said, I've been talking about this for probably 7 or 8 years now, and it's always been, well, build it and we'll come. And I think that the more exposure we get out there, the more people will come and visit, and they'll see that it's a good thing. And yeah, I think we're in good shape, I think, moving forward to address that pressing data center skills problem.
Yeah, and in terms, you described the environment you're looking to put together, but in terms of the actual qualifications, the programs you're offering, presumably you'll build it out over time, but what are the sort of core offerings that are going to be available, to start with?
Yeah. So for the remainder of this year, we've got we're doing 3 or 4 sessions. So the one is where we're delivering our Building Sustainable Data Centers course, which is kind of like it's a new course, and I don't think anybody elsewhere in the training field is actually looking at this. So we're kind of going, well, what does the data center of the future look like? What is it going to be compiled with? Are we going to be looking at if we want to address the energy problem, and we want to address the legislation, and we want to address the resources, we're going to have to learn to do more with less. So this whole course will be about, has the last 50 years of data center engineering, is it really suitable for the 21st century? So we're looking at risk, we're looking at risk profiles, we're looking at construction materials, we're looking at how you manage your IT estate within that environment. And this is, sometimes I feel that the entire trade press and some of the events are all really much focused on professional data centers, co-location facilities and large hyperscalers. They only represent 15% of the data center installed estate. 85% of it, probably less now, 80%, are little server rooms tucked away in office buildings, and those people don't come to our events, right? Because they're too busy, because they're mostly IT people firefighting their IT infrastructure, which they've inherited from the past and is maintained today. So we're asking the question of, is what you've got installed now fit for purpose? Does it actually meet the business needs or the organizational needs in the way that it was intended, or should have, has things moved on since the original architecture? Are there things you can do that will change that? So we're very much going to be asking questions of our delegates. We want them to think about what it is they're doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it. And I'll give you an example. So as you know, I went to Mauritius for 7 weeks back in 2013 to deliver some training to the government of Mauritius. And I have a slide on our cooling course, and it says, what's your temperature or your operating range for your temperature? What's your operating humidity range? And why did you do it? Right? And I asked the question, and I always used to get back 18 to 21 degrees, 50% plus or minus 5% RH, and we don't know. We don't know why we do it. And then the next slide has, and this is not a slide I've manipulated. The next slide said 18 to 21 degrees, 50% plus or minus, and you don't know why you're doing it. So they're all kind of going, oh, are you some sort of soothsayer? I said, no, because this is the same thing I get every time. You don't know why you're doing it. And I said, oh, this is why you're doing it, because of paper tape and punched cards. Well, when was the last time you saw paper tape and punched cards inside your data center environment? Probably never. So why are we pandering to a 20th century environmental range for a product that we no longer see? It's, but we're always designing to that. So yeah, building sustainable data centers, we really want to make our delegates think. So we're going to be thinking about, replacing steel with cross-laminated timber. We're looking at using biocretes, and there has been some movement in that recently with using biocretes. It really depends on which jurisdiction you're in and whether the availability of those actual things are there. We've been looking at using industrial hemp for internal panel work because it has some significant environmental benefits, and basically just standard audited airflow management techniques, what your options are for electrical power moving forward, because you might not be able to get it from the grid, especially if it's big. We look, and one of the biggest things is waste heat reuse. So, we all know that there's been this kind of discussion on waste heat reuse for some time. Very few practical examples. So we want to kind of go into that a little bit more. We're also doing our Data Center 101 course, which is an entry level, which is suitable for students. We actually successfully delivered that for the Birmingham City University over 4 years. We're doing the Green IT Fundamentals, which is a little bit more across the user devices, network and data center environment. So that's probably more focused towards smaller enterprises, and again, ask them questions about why they do the things they do. And then we're developing a power systems course. We've got courses on carbon accounting for data centers, and a lot more on the EN 5600 series. So we're going to basically provide some background to that. I'll go to events, as you know, Phil, and you talk to people and go, oh, what do you know about 5600? And we either met with a blank face, or, oh, it's a set of data center standards. And you go, well, okay, are you using them? No. You go, like, why not? These are going to come mandatory. They definitely are mandatory in Europe with the Energy Efficiency Directive, more on the KPI side. But, these standards are developed by groups of industry professionals to kind of professionalize the industry. And it's a tragedy that not more people are using them. And I think that needs to change. And I think that might well be mandated by, impending UK government legislation in the future. But we're pretty flexible. So we've actually asked the industry, what do you want us to train? Because we can we have got, in effect, a data center that looks, smells, feels, and sounds like a data center with no customer in. Our customers are basically servers running emulator scripts and load banks. So we can really push the boundaries in any direction you want to take within the facility. I mean, we've even thought about doing, planning courses. Okay, so we've got a big capital plant change happening at our data center. How do we go around doing that? I think if you haven't done it before, moving a 50-ton chiller or 40-ton chiller off the roof of a building and putting it and then replacing it is not something you do every day of the week. So maybe there's some, and we know that there are a lot of data centers that are approaching their kind of end of life replacement cycle for UPSs and chiller units. And, yeah, there's a lot of things we can do in terms of the process of managing that to make sure that it goes well. And of course, the other thing is that we want other training providers to deliver their courses. So, that's where we're hoping to be, this time next year. I want to see full capacity, really. And we've got 3 rooms, so we can actually do 36 delegates a week. And we've got the possibility of taking the adjacent building if we get too much demand. But then my problem then will be where do I get the lecturers from?
Yeah, and so in turn, I mean, you've kind of explained the audience, but just to reconfirm who you're aiming these at. It sounds like everything from entry level to bespoke courses for company. Just give us a flavour, I suppose, of who you're targeting.
Yeah, so as I said, so we've got the people that are working in enterprises and public sector operating small on-premise data centers. We rarely get to see them at events, and judging from some of the sites I've visited, there is a lot of improvements to be made. In fact, one of our suppliers, they do this quite regularly, and they're actually setting the room up in the next couple of weeks. And they've been telling me some horror stories about rooms they've walked into, which are they're literally a heartbeat away from failing. And I was reading a report earlier, and it was just a litany of disasters, both from a technical point of view, a managerial point of view, and ambient weather conditions that caused this facility to fail quite spectacularly. And when you look at the report and you're going through and thinking, yeah, we could have addressed that at this point. You could have addressed it at this point, and this point, and this point, and this point. And yet there was this catalogue of failures. And what we want to do is to be able to do, to speak about that as well. But we want to also talk about the ones that are in the professional co-location community. And I've spoken about this on many of our webinars. These guys sit on site and they're operating and they think they're doing a really good job. And then when somebody from outside comes in, they realize that actually they're not doing a good job at all. And so they can't see the wood for the trees, right? And I think we can help them there. But that's also looking at the supply chain to signpost the direction of travel with respect to the legislation in the future. And finally, providing a basic overview of data engineering, but also the sales and management and people that want to transition into the sector, especially those leading the armed furnaces. So the final audience is new blood, so grads, A-level students, etc. And we're doing that by partnering with the local schools and universities to get our DC 101 courses on optional module. Basically spend a morning or an afternoon a week on our 13-week course covering the basics, and they will see the principles and techniques in practical areas. And we delivered that course, as I said earlier, to the Birmingham City University for 4 years. And we structured that so they actually visited Data Center World in London. They all came down as a group and wandered around, and they had a treasure hunt to do. So they had to pick up brochures from the major capital plant suppliers. So yes, we want you to get a brochure from a switchgear manufacturer, a chiller manufacturer, crack units, and anything else that you can think of. Just get it. There's no prizes for it, but it'd be useful for your assignment. And then it culminated in a visit to an actual data center. So we arranged a visit to a data center that was local to them, and we took students around. And I'll never forget, we came out on the roof, and one of the students, he was actually quite clued up, and he was looking at this. I'm not going to mention the manufacturer, but it's a manufacturer that manufactures an evaporative air-cooled unit in the Birmingham area. And there it was sitting there, the 3 of them on this roof. And he kind of looked at it and he went, oh, wow. He says, I actually used that company and that particular product in my assignment. I didn't realize how big it was. And his mouth dropped open. And I think, and we've done courses with the BRE when they were doing their BREEAM update for the annexes for data centers, probably about 6 years ago now. And we took them to another data center. I did 3 days at the BRE establishment in Watford, and then we took them on the 4th day to this data center. And the feedback I got afterwards was, individually, the kind of course you delivered was great, but it wasn't until that final day that everything kind of slipped into focus, and everything got stitched together around that last day. And that's why we feel that practical training is, an essential, I think, moving forward. But then I would say that, I'm promoting my academy. So, yeah.
And in terms of, you mentioned obviously you're working with local academic organisations, but other partners, I think that I'm right in saying you're working alongside the DCA and I think government initiatives as well. So just, if you can explain who else is sort of part or at least, helping you with the project.
Well, actually, one of the earliest kind of formulation of thoughts for the academy arose from a conversation that myself, Steve Hone, and Samuel Campbell White had, rest in peace, Simon, back in 2015 when we were doing the Eureka project, right? And we actually mapped out what a kind of national data center academy would look like in terms of it being very much a visitor center to kind of open to the public what data centers actually did. And that's the one thing that's missing from this initiative, but we can probably do it when we move, which we probably will, because I'm hoping we'll expand out. But we wanted the training center and everything. So that's where it originally came from. So the Data Center Alliance and Steve Hone have been very supportive of the initiative. They've given me a lot of opportunity to speak at the data center transformation events, a lot of stuff in the press and the publications, yourselves included. But we've also been talking, recently got elected onto the Tech UK Data Center Council. Not quite sure because, it's 80% made up of operators. And I think the head of data centers there wanted somebody to be the cat amongst the pigeons. So we're actually on all 3 of their working committees. So we work in the skills committee, we're working in the ESG committee, and they are going to promote the National Data Center Academy via some of their reports that they push out, obviously cascade it out to the operators that are part of the Data Center Council themselves. But we're also working with the West Midlands. We put a process in with the West Midlands Combined Authority, but we are working with Coventry and Warwickshire Growth Hub and their Skills Hub. And that's quite an interesting diversion for them because there are very few data centers in the Coventry and Warwickshire region, right? We've got the IBM site at Warwick itself, and then there are very few and far between other co-location sites. There probably are smaller enterprise sites and even large enterprise sites, but they don't actually have visibility of them. What is interesting is that, and I didn't know this until probably this time last year, Leamington Spa is actually known as Silicon Spa, right? And it's a gaming hub, right? Apparently 20% of all the games that are created globally originate in Leamington Spa or the environment. And you're kind of thinking, well, these guys are creating games, so they must have server rooms. And we have an opportunity to talk to somebody at the Warwickshire County Council that heads up the digital division. And she said, we've got 18 companies that work in gaming in our region. And they're crying out for co-location and training. Oh, okay, here we go. We can point them towards co-location, and we can definitely give them training to optimize the facilities they've got. So I'm quite hoping to go and visit some very interesting gaming customers in the next couple of months. We also want, we've got an open invitation for the operators to come up, and obviously we need equipment. So we've been reaching out to certain suppliers, and we have had considerable amount of offers of equipment, either brand new or refurbished, so we can put it in and we'll stitch it all together and get it operating. And I think, again, there's a lot of focus on new stuff at all the events. It's replace this, replace that. And actually, some organizations can't just go out and drop 100 grand on a new chiller. They have to make do with what they want. So one of the some of the courses that we'll be doing, be able to kind of extend the life of those operations, but have the actual manufacturer providing that what you do to extend it. But I mean, you know, some of the things we're working with the NES on the ticker project, but that's kind of separate. We did a lot of surveys on sites for the ticker project, and what we found out from the cooling perspective is that once the item's manufactured, they usually only provide 2-year warranty from that company, and then from the 3rd year it goes into a third party, and that's then for the customer to decide. And of course, you know, everybody's going to go on price, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the person you've engaged to do your servicing is actually a data center aware company. And unfortunately, that has resulted in quite a, you know, I'll be generous, not optimal cooling solution servicing arrangements have been done in some of the survey sites that we went, even ones that you'd think were going to be pretty good, were actually not doing the things that you would expect. So we want to get them in. We've also had some work, you know, we've had a couple of design and build companies that want to come and help us out with the design work, which we've said thank you very much, and they have provided some provisional designs for us. And we haven't asked them to sign NDAs, but we're keeping their involvement secret until the press and open days, which will be in October. We are going to launch our website in the next couple of weeks, and we'll be running some special promotions to attract members, more members from the operating community and the supply chain. So they'll get discounts basically off of membership, which we think is actually pretty competitive anyway.
As you alluded to already, the main focus, obviously you're doing a lot of things, but your major focus is intended to be educating folks around decarbonising their ICT estates, or I suppose flip it the other way, sort of designing, building, operating, etc., a sustainable data centre. And I'm guessing, knowing you well, when you're talking about a sustainable data centre, you're not talking about one that just has a bit of renewable power and whatever. It's from the sort of ground up sustainable data centres. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the focus is around decarbonising the estates, the legacy environment and the future environments. And you're quite right in what you said. I think, you know, we've been discussing this internally as well and at some of the events recently. The code of conduct, you know, we're in the 15th year of the best practices, 160 best practices. And yet I'll still go on sites and I'll see that some of those best practices haven't been implemented. And I'm thinking, why haven't you done this? And kind of like, it's fear, uncertainty and doubt, right? So it's fear of, if I do that, will it affect something else and cause that to break? And am I looking at a massive cascade failure? Uncertainty of whether or not the best practice is applicable for them, and the doubt that the best practice will work. Well, I can assuage the doubt part because we know they work. Right, we've seen that. There have been examples of exemplary data centers that have adopted all of the code of conduct best practices, and they've saved significant amount of money and energy. I mean, I'll give you an example. I did a CEDAR assessment in Mexico a couple of years ago. They were using a caged environment. They went to hot cold aisle alignment and saved them 40,000 euros a month in air conditioning costs. I went to another one of their sites. We were talking about free cooling. They had free cooling capability on their system, but they weren't using it. I won't tell you the reason why they weren't using it, but anyway, we said to them, do this, and they did that, and they saved themselves another 50,000 euro a month just by getting the free cooling sorted out. And then the final one, they had team working crack units, and they hadn't set them up for crack team working. So once they went to team working mode, they sent another 50,000 euro a month. So that particular organisation saved 1.2 million in energy costs just from an external assessment. And so and that was just one best practice. So if you look at all of the others and take them in harmony and actually use the practices as they're supposed to be done, then our significant energy savings can be obtained. And you know this, Phil, right? We can look back through the back issues of your magazine and you will see me moaning about the application of the code of conduct best practices and not happening, and saying you might as well be standing on the steps of your data center burning £50 notes, because that's what you're doing. So we want to do that. In the estate, in the code of conduct room, as the delegates walk in, it will be horrible. It will have a PUE of over 2. There will be no air management at all. There'll be cables flying across the floor. It will not be managed. And over the duration of the course, they will optimize that room, and we will measure the savings. And we've already spoken to the Joint Research Centre over in Europe about actually doing a more academic program for this. So what we'll do is we will start off, we'll monitor everything from day one, and we have to commission the room anyway. So we'll actually do all of the best practices and steps and record our findings, and then we'll use that as in our course material, but also to give us a kind of the best it can be in this room environment. And then we're not going to give the delegates access to that. This is what you need to do to get it the best. We will make them work for it. So we're going to have role playing exercises. Your financial director has said you've got to find a minimum of 10%. Yep, okay. Can I have some money? No, you have to make any savings from the savings that you can buy stuff, but you have to get savings from the facility. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to put some old equipment in, link it back to the central master database, and find out that piece of kit's been in there drawing power and network, yet it's never been used for 6 years, right? And I've seen that, Phil, in projects I've gone on to. I went back to one site and there was this whole rack of equipment. I was like, but we decommissioned that 6 years ago, but it's still working, and it's £14,000 a server a year. It's like madness. So as I said earlier, we've got the 3 technical areas. The one is the code of conduct, which is actually under construction at the moment. We've got the power room, we've got the active room, but we'll also be teaching them the correct ways to calculate the 30134 metrics, because we've had some horror stories. I was chatting to Mark Acton, and you know very well, and he was chatting to this guy in Germany. And he said, what's your PUE? And I said, it's 1.4. He said, how did you get that? He said, it was the difference between what we pay for power and what we charge for power. Right? No, it isn't. and on LinkedIn recently, we've had a quite significant US kind of expert talking about PUE, but completely wrong. And when we he got a massive pile-on, as you can imagine, and he kind of went, well, I don't care what you guys think. You're just academics. This is why our clients want. And we're kind of like, oh my God, this guy is actually telling major companies how to do stuff, and he doesn't understand it. And that's wrong. So we want to be able to show them practically how to calculate all of those ISO 30134 metrics. And that will be very useful for European clients, because they're going to face that pain very, very shortly. But also, I think it's going to be useful for UK clients, because we've been looking at the CCA data, and that hasn't, it's quite high now, but the amount of companies that haven't been implementing the energy savings as they're required to has remained the same. So it's over half of the climate change agreement participants haven't met their targets. So we think that there's room to maneuver there. Yeah, so the other thing we're going to do, we're quite keen on the power area, because we've been talking to a power expert, and he's basically said, oh, you wouldn't believe the amount of near misses we're getting on simple power related items. And it could just be replacement of UPSs, putting UPSs in the standby mode, dealing with mains failure outages, how do you get it back up, all that sort of stuff. So we thought, well, why not create a kind of simulator for that as well? That's not ready yet, but it's definitely something that we'll be pursuing next. And we're also going to throw some fault conditions on there, so that'll be interesting. It is going to be very much like an aircraft simulator, that particular area. You know, like when pilots have to retrain every 6 months, they have to go to a special simulator. So this is what we want to create. We're going to create a kind of power system simulator and get the guys to come and everyone, you know, maybe not every 6 months, maybe a year, but just to kind of refresh themselves of what they would do in various scenarios. And we can, I think with the digital twin aspect, we should be able to take on real sites, virtually render them. So when the guy puts his headset on, he's actually thinks he's in his own site. But we can then throw in, oh, there's a fire alarm's just gone off in the UPS room. You best check that out then, and see what necessary, you know, see whether or not he follows the correct steps.
Yeah, I'm going to ask in a minute the big sort of sustainability questions, but perhaps before we do, just be good to understand, because I know you keep yourself very busy. Just give us a flavour of the other things that are Carbon 3IT is sort of involved in at the moment.
Well, our biggest customer at the moment is the Start campus in Portugal, and that is we're very proud about that because it is the largest data center construction project in Europe. You know, they recently announced a doubling of size from 486 megawatts to 1.2 gigawatts across 5 buildings, and we've been working with them for some time. And we're effectively embedded client side on sustainability team. So we have regular meetings with them, and our job there is to basically sanity check all of the design decisions that are being made. We created a load of procurement items for them, but primarily we're creating a carbon footprint of the actual construction in real time. We're not using any LCA or one-click LCA type things. We're actually doing it, you know, really looking at the product that we are using, the amount of quantity, and we've developed that, and we've got that model now, and we're just doing some final tweaks on it. We're also working with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and other partners on the transport industrial refrigeration and cooling project, and we're leading the data center stream on that. And finally, a very interesting project we're working on is the Suboptic Foundation, Internet Society, and the University of California, Berkeley on a project called the Sustainable Subsea Networks. And we're primarily looking at cable landing stations, which obviously are very, very close to data centers. But we've recently been approached to assist the marine group. So this is a project that's looking at sustainability of Trans-Pacific and transatlantic and Middle East and shallow water subsea cables in the Asia Pac area, and we're looking at how we can make them more sustainable. So obviously we've looked at it and we've got, this is the second phase of the project, but the first bit was how do you make a cable sustainable? Not an easy task, let me assure you. But also it's the installation of those cables, right? So, and there's a whole huge area that we haven't, I knew of it because of my work in the past, but looking at it in a more kind of more recent focus light, and again, because we've got data centers expanding like crazy, we've got these subsea network cables expanding like crazy as well. And they're facing some, you know, issues on their own. I mean, I'm going to be speaking about that at Capacity Europe in a couple of weeks' time. I'm moderating a panel between some of the operators, and I've had the pleasure of talking to some of them yesterday. And they were, you know, we had a really long call, and it was quite in focus. And we'll relay that back to the stuff, and then. Finally, we're still doing our assessments for various third parties on data centers. We do it on our own bat as well. So it's mostly code of conduct stuff, CEDA assessments. We're also doing taxonomy climate delegated act assessments, which is primarily to access green financing. And of course, we're expecting to see a lot more on the 5600 standard, the 5-1, because that's the kind of like the data center maturity model standard. But we think and we know that it's probably likely to be the de facto European legislation that will replace the assessment framework for the code of conduct. So we thought we'd get geared up on that, and we're actually going to do some training courses on that, because in fact, I would say that globally, it's probably the most definitive assessment of what a sustainable data center should be. So it's really in depth. Really, it's a really good piece of work. And so we're doing the assessments on that.
Okay, and back to sustainable data centers.
Yeah.
The big question, which I always like to ask, and depending on where they're coming from, I can almost predict the answers. But in your case, I probably can't. But if you were marking the industry's progress to date, and then comparing it with what needs to be done, and bearing in mind AI is threatening on the horizon. Was it Google, I think, announced, just casually that their carbon footprint's actually gone up nearly 50%, thanks in main part to their AI activities, should we say. So just your thoughts, I suppose, as to the progress the industry's made to date, and how much further they have to go, and how easy that will be, as they bearing in mind the world becomes more and more digital, as each day passes, I suppose.
Well, I'm going to go back to my old woodworking teacher on my own personal school report, right? And this was the kind of third year, and I wasn't going to take woodworking. I was rubbish at it, to be honest. But I remember his entry in the school report was, I think it would be safe to say that John's interests lie elsewhere, right? And therefore should not seek a position within the woodworking industry. I'm sure they think that they're doing a good job, right? The operators. But as I said earlier, they're still in effect building 20th century data centers to 20th century designs, and they're just tinkering around the edges, Oh, well, we're going to put HVO in instead of diesel generators. Well, I'd question the need for generators anyway, right? Because we've done some research into this, and and I'm not going to, spend some time. Maybe we'll have that over a beer at the Data Center Alliance conference. But nothing much has changed in the basic building blocks of data center design since the late 90s. It's literally been HVO here and a little bit of evaporative cooling there, right? Basically, everything else is the same. There are some outliers that are adopting the latest construction concepts. Like, for instance, I mentioned cross-laminated timber and biocretes, and I'll point you towards EcoDC in Sweden for that. So they have got their superstructure is cross-laminated timber. And I know that there are a number of projects that are still on the drawing board seeking funding that we've personally been involved in, where we have said, let's really push the boundary here and think outside the box. And that has been very well received by the people that have are in the process of financing that. So there are a number of outliers, but they're very few and far between. And personally, and I've said this, the sector doesn't appear to understand we're in a climate emergency. It absolutely doesn't. They just want to build. They've got these massive expansion plans, putting footprint in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it. And I absolutely understand why they're doing that. There are a number of reasons for that. But the regulations are looming, and we've got an energy shortage coming up. In certain, especially in the traditional regions, and other resources are getting scarce. And you basically mentioned it earlier about NVIDIA chips and other AI chips, being quite difficult to get hold of and quite expensive. The thing is we can't continue to go on the way we've been going. Things have to change, and I think that's going to require a radical rethink by everybody in the sector and beyond. And the sooner that they get that into their heads, the better for the industry, because at the moment, I think they're at risk of building stranded assets. Right? I think that if they continue to build the way they've built now, in 10 years' time, they're going to fall foul of so many legislative requirements. And I'll give an example to this. Coal-fired power stations were quite happily forecasting 50 or 60 years worth of life. Even the newer ones thought they were going to be around for ages. I think our last coal-fired power station is closing this month on the 30th of September at Radcliffe-on-Soar. But the EU basically issued the Large Combustion Plant Directive. I think it came out in 2015, must have been before 2015. But it basically said, you need to put carbon capture and storage equipment on your chimneys, or you've got 20,000 hours of operation and we'll shut you down, right? So we had a lot of companies kind of looking at carbon capture and storage and thought, you know what, nah, it's too expensive, untold. So let's just shut down that plant. So the EU shut down most of the European coal industry because of emissions. And I don't think the data center industry is anywhere near that level of emissions. But I basically say to people, don't think that you've got a free pass on this, because you haven't. If the commission's going to shut down power stations, it's going to shut down a small, inefficient data center that's running at a PUE of 2, especially when you've had 15 years of the code of conduct, best practice regulations, and we talk about it every opportunity we get, and you've still not managed to reduce your PUE from 2 to 1.5. So I think the industry is going to have a rapid wake-up call. It's going to have to do more with less, and that may well mean a radical rethink of a lot of things. So cooling, security protocols, energy provision, DC, the AC energy flow is probably, a bit under threat because there's multiple transitions, and that means you waste energy, or energy is wasted. So I can see a lot more DC power systems coming into play. And, I've been speaking to people that make components in the DC, and they kind of go, we can't understand why the data center industry doesn't use DC. It's so more efficient than that. So the radical rethink, and I think, I've been calling a radical rethink for probably about 4 years now. And I think every passing year, the radical rethink just becomes more and more pressing.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, our digital sort of objectives and sustainable objectives, are they compatible, or at some stage? I mean, you've mentioned obviously the radical overhaul which is needed, and I totally agree, but at some stage, and this isn't necessarily the data center industry's problem, but whether it's the EU or governments say, stop, this digital world's gone too far, it's consuming too many assets, etc. So we're going to have, whether we give each individual so many carbon credits a year or whatever, all these different theories. Do you think we will inevitably end up at that stage, or is it possible that we can carry on in a digital consuming world, if you like, that will also become sustainable?
Yeah, so you're moving on to kind of green IT fundamental things there. So one of the things I would say is that there's a hell of a lot of work we can do on green coding, and they have been slow. I've got to say, the coding guys have been slow to come on, but they are definitely on board now. I'm going to the Data Center Connect next week, but I'm also going to the Green IO event, which is on the Thursday. And there's been a host of there's the Green Software Foundation. There's a few people that have written green coding books, and that's all about optimizing the actual code that's running on these PCs and servers. And so that should be able to reduce the actual IT load down a bit. And then we've got kind of, in terms of the raw materials, there's a lot more. We don't recycle a lot of our electronic equipment, and we've got this. And it's not so much present, is it? Yeah. So the worst case is the mobile phone industry, right? So I have on my Samsung here, which I had to replace because I left its previous one in a cab, right? But I was quite happy, and that was 3 years old, and I was quite happy it did what I needed it to do. And I would have kept it for another 2 or 3 years. I mean, in fact, my provider was almost forcing me to upgrade in a 3-year contract. And I don't think that that's necessary, right? But I understand the business model that kind of forces them down that route. And I would say, well, you need to change your business model, because 86% of the embodied carbon is in the manufacture of this phone. It's only 14% of it's in the use phase. Right, so if you're continually asking us to replace our phones, there's a lot of embodied carbon in doing that, right? And you need to make your phones more recyclable, so we can capture the necessary rare earths out of that. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the coding side of things. But I think the coding side, they're on board now. They're getting to grips. I'm not convinced the manufacturers of mobile phone and equipment suppliers are quite there yet. I did have a conversation with one of the major manufacturers probably that this time last year, and he understood exactly where I was coming from, but he said, we cannot go alone. If we were to extend our warranty from 3 to 4 years, people would still go with the companies that had 3-year warranties, right? So we've all got to go to 4-year warranties or 5-year warranties or 8-year warranties. And what will happen is if you're able to sweat your assets longer, and we're slowing down the pace of technological change, so Moore's law actually does come back into focus again, what you're effectively doing is you're reducing their sales cycle, right? They're not going to shift as many units as they are, and that's going to make their investors unhappy and the stock market's unhappy. And maybe that's part of the problem. Is capitalism the right tool to deliver the decarbonisation of the world? And I think they'd like to think so, but I think it's becoming increasingly clear that they're not going to be able to do that with that sort of approach. And it's going to be interesting. As I said, we live in interesting times, and they've got to step up a little bit more, I think, if they want capitalism to continue the way it does, because it certainly is not addressing stuff.
But it's sorry, to that point, it's surely it's the levels, because I mean, I've bored people in the past. I always quote my parents. They bought their 3-piece suite. 10 years later, they reupholstered it. 10 years later, they reupholstered it, and somebody was selling sofas and still making money, but they weren't making money every 3 years or whatever it was. But they would.
Yeah.
So you have to adjust your, if you like, profit expectations, which could be done again, but you have to, as you say, get everyone to say that's fine, as opposed to one sort of brave company going out on a limb, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, they're with the odd example of companies that have gone out on a limb, and they're quite successful in doing so. But they tend to be a little bit more expensive than everybody else. And I think there's Terry Pratchett mentions it. Is it the boots grime syndrome or something? So you buy boots every year, but they wear out, but they're 50 quid. And if you buy a good pair of boots, that will last you for 20 years, and you just keep polishing them. I've actually done that. I've eaten my own dog food. So I bought myself a pair of Trax boots, which they were expensive. They were nearly 200 quid. But I was going through a pair of boots every year. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to buy a good pair of boots, and hopefully they'll last me for a lot longer. And they're, typical. Coming back to your point, so yes, I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and I'm not quite sure if that's in my remit. That's probably a more political viewpoint to take. And the thing is, I would say that that's the sort of thing that Jeremy Corbyn was talking about, a couple of election cycles ago, and he was roundly rejected by the electorate. And then that resulted in 14 years of the previous mob, who seemed to have been kind of overseeing a circle of decline. And now we've got a new government, so let's see where they go. But I've got to say, from a data center perspective, they do seem to be kind of following the previous lot's kind of approach, and I'm not quite sure that's going to be necessarily good for the country or them moving forward. So, but however, I am working in the background, kind of like to try and change their view on a few things.
So, I mean, just in finishing then, how optimistic or not would you be that the industry, along with the regulatory environment, I suppose, can get us to where we need to be, or do you worry that we'll be having the same conversation if we're still doing our jobs in 10 years' time, wondering when the industry is actually going to start making the radical changes that are required?
So I kind of think I've alluded to it all the way through the conversation, is that at the end of the day, I think we need to revisit the entire approach, and we have to cut our coats according to the cloth that we have, right? And I think, in the past, probably 30 odd years, there has been a never-ending supply of cloth that this cloth is likely to become more expensive, more restrictive, and only available from a few outlets. So we're going to have to cut our coat according to that cloth. So I think there will be, there needs to be, I mean, I've been talking about the radical redesign, and I think, you know, we're going to have to look at this as well. And in this case, the cloth is the energy, the regulations, the supply chain length, etc. So I think that as ambitions will have to be scaled back, right? You know, I think it was Mark Acton that actually mentioned this. He's called it megawatt waving, right? So people are basically going into events and then, you know, waving their megawatts around. 300 megawatts here,
Yep.
half a megawatt there, etc. You know, and to me, that's just smacks of, you know, that's not thinking. That's just basically showing, you know, something that you may or may not have. I've got to say, I think there's an appalling lack of realism in the sector at the moment because of this 300 megawatt, 500 megawatt, gigawatt. And I want to make this clear. I'm not saying that we shouldn't build out digital infrastructure to that level, but it should be energy efficient and sustainable. Currently it isn't, but that has to change because there won't be any alternative. You know. So coming back to your question, sometimes I have good days and sometimes I have bad days. So on my bad days, I kind of look at it and I'm looking at LinkedIn and I'll see, you know, an aggregate total of, you know, maybe 5 gigawatts of new projects announced. And then I think, yeah, it's never going to happen, right? And I don't know why they're thinking that, because that's never going to happen. I know that area, there's not the sufficient power. There's too much stuff needed at grid scale, but new grid capacity. We haven't got the generation capacity. It's never going to happen. And then sometimes I have really good days. When I look at it and I find out, you know, the Cambridge guys coming out with that low carbon concrete proposal a couple of weeks ago, finding out that actually we can start to use cross-laminated timber, the green steel. You know, if we insist on using steel, use green steel that's manufactured in electric arc furnaces in France or in Sweden using new carbon-free technologies, and then things like the border adjustment mechanism, which will even up cheap imports of steel from India and China and make them on a level of steel that's manufactured in Europe. Right. So you're not going to get any benefit from buying cheap, very carbon intensive steel when you could buy steel around the corner. So that kind of keeps our industries going, or European industries going. It will hopefully, you know, the Indians and the Chinese will go, well, we can't sell our steel into Europe anymore. We're going to have to decarbonise our grid quicker. And I recall being on an Indian Green Building Council webinar about 2 years ago. And we had a pre-call and the guys were sitting there and I just went, right, I'm moderating this panel, my friends, right? And it's about sustainability and none of you can describe your operations as being sustainable, right? So let's just don't even mention that because I'll be on you like a rash. Your primary task, in my opinion, is to put pressure on your government to decarbonise your grid, right? And you need to move away from coal. And so your country has got one of the largest solar gained that you've got, and you need to start thinking about doing this. So yeah, I think we'll get there. We're going to have some hiccups on the way. The road's going to be a bit rocky, but I'm pretty sure that the legislation and I think consumer pressure will come into play as well. So the customers of the cloud providers, the customers of the large co-location providers, they will be under the same legislative requirements as their suppliers. And they will be saying, we want you to build more sustainable, more energy efficient data centers. And, you know, or we'll go to somewhere who is. So hopefully once that cycle starts, we'll get this flurry of people that are kind of adopting the more up-to-date and sustainable best practices initiatives. The other thing to think of is I think the assessment criteria is probably going to get a little bit more onerous as well. I think there's a lot of people getting free passes at the moment because they're kind of confusing the ground with the oh, we're accredited to this, oh, but we're accredited to that. Oh, we're accredited to both of them. And we've got this other one as well. And I think they need to be consolidated. And listen, you know, when you're a drowning man, they're going to grasp at straws, and these are grasping straws. What they should be doing is coming to speak to me, and I'll throw them a life jacket.
No, that's been fantastic to chat to you. I mean, I wish you every success for the
Thank
National
you.
Data Center Academy. And as ever, great for you to share your thoughts on what's going on in the industry and the sustainability agenda. But John, really
Excellent.
appreciate your time. Thank you.